On a cold Tuesday morning in February of 1974, a 23-year-old man named Calvin Pruitt walked into the Dearborn County Courthouse in Lawrenceburg, Indiana, and paid $32,000 for 80 acres of land that nobody else in the county would touch. The land sat in the southeast corner of the county, in a low bowl between two ridge lines where water collected and stayed. It had a name. Locals called it the Greer Bottom, not because of anything that had grown there, but because of the family that had failed there. 3 generations of Greers had tried to farm that ground. 3 generations had given up. The last of them, an old man named Emmett Greer, had stopped farming it in 1961 and spent the next 8 years watching the weeds take over before the county finally seized it for back taxes. Since 1969, the Greer Bottom had sat empty. The asking price had dropped every year. $150 an acre, then $120, then $90, then $80. By the time Calvin Pruitt showed up at the auction, the county was asking $400 for the whole 80 acres. Not $400 an acre, $400 total. $5 an acre for ground that the county assessor had officially described in the auction listing as agriculturally non-viable. Calvin paid the $400 and signed the deed. He was the only bidder. The room cleared out before he'd finished signing. Nobody lingered to congratulate him. Nobody shook his hand. The clerk stamped the papers with the expression of someone processing a transaction they expected to process again in 2 or 3 years when the same land came back through foreclosure under a different name. Calvin drove out to look at what he'd bought. He parked his truck at the edge of a field that hadn't been worked in 13 years. The soil was gray and packed. Weeds had taken over, the scrubby kind that grow where nothing else will. There was standing water in the low corner, even in February, even with frost still in the ground. The fence line had collapsed in 2 places. He stood there for 20 minutes looking at it. Then he drove to the county extension office. Let me tell you about Calvin Pruitt, because the thing he did next was not what anyone expected. And to understand why he did it, you need to understand who he was. Calvin was born in 1951, the youngest son of Robert and June Pruitt. The Pruitts farmed 160 acres of decent ground 12 miles north of the Greer Bottom. Not exceptional land, but reliable. The kind of ground that produced consistent yields and let a family get by without too much drama. Calvin had grown up farming it. He knew soybeans and corn and the rhythm of planting and harvest and the particular anxiety of watching a sky that wasn't doing what you needed it to do. But Calvin had also done something that none of his brothers had done. He had gone to Purdue, not for a degree. He couldn't afford 4 years of tuition. He'd attended for 1 semester on a partial scholarship before the money ran out and he'd come back to the farm. But that 1 semester had given him something. It had given him the beginning of a different way of looking at soil. The professor who taught his introductory agronomy course was a man named Dr. Lawrence Bauer, a slight man with thick glasses who had spent 30 years studying Indiana soils and who approached every question about land with the same fundamental conviction: there are no bad fields, only undiagnosed ones. Calvin had sat in the front row of that class for 16 weeks. He'd taken notes that he still had in a binder in his truck, worn and coffee-stained, but intact. Dr. Bauer's first lecture had begun with a single sentence written on the chalkboard. Before you decide a field cannot be farmed, find out why it isn't. Calvin had written that sentence at the top of his notes. He'd looked at it 100 times since. When he stood at the edge of the Greer Bottom on a February morning in 1974 and saw 13 years of failure and dead weeds and standing water, he did not see a cursed field or a hopeless cause. He heard Dr. Bauer's voice in his head. Find out why it isn't. The extension office in Lawrenceburg was run by a man named Dale Sherwood, a county agent of the old school who had been helping Dearborn County farmers for 22 years. He was a quiet man, patient, methodical, the kind of person who answered questions without condescension and who had a gift for making complicated things understandable. Calvin walked in and told Dale he'd just bought the Greer Bottom. Dale set down his coffee. The whole 80 acres? All of it. Calvin, that land has been fallow since Emmett Greer quit on it in '61. Before Emmett, his father tried it, Before that, his grandfather. Nobody's ever made a crop there worth talking about. I know. That's why I need to test it. Dale leaned back. Test it how? Soil test. Full panel. pH, nutrients, organic matter, everything you can measure. Dale was quiet for a moment. He had the particular expression of a man who was surprised to be surprised. In 22 years as a county agent, he had helped hundreds of farmers with soil problems. He had rarely been asked to test a field before anyone tried to farm it. Farmers generally tested soil after something went wrong, not before. When do you want to do it? Today, Calvin said, if you have time. They drove out to the Greer bottom that afternoon. Calvin had already mapped the field in his head, dividing it into sections based on what he'd observed that morning. The low corner where water stood, the middle section where the soil looked gray, the higher ground along the north fence where the weeds were slightly more robust. 3 distinct zones, each of which might tell a different story. Dale showed Calvin how to pull samples properly, not just from the surface, but from depth, from multiple locations in each zone, combined into composite samples that would give an accurate picture of what was happening through the soil profile. They spent 2 hours walking the field, pulling cores with a sampling probe, labeling bags, recording locations. Calvin paid $12 for the analysis. Dale said results would take 10 days to 2 weeks. Calvin drove back to the Greer bottom every day for the next 12 days. He brought his notes from Dr. Bauer's class. He walked the field in sections, kneeling to look at the soil structure, pressing it between his fingers, watching where water moved after rain, noticing where it pooled and where it drained. He pushed a steel rod into the ground at 50-foot intervals across the worst sections, measuring the depth before he hit resistance. Something solid below the surface, an impermeable layer, was trapping water in the low areas. He made notes. He drew maps. He asked questions that nobody was answering yet. On day 13, Dale called. Calvin, you need to come in. The soil test results were spread across Dale's desk when Calvin arrived. Dale had paper-clipped a handwritten summary to the front of the folder. Calvin sat down and read. The first thing he noticed was the pH readings. The composite sample from the low corner showed a pH of 4.8. The middle section showed 5.1. Even the higher ground along the north fence, the best-looking part of the field, was only 5.4. He looked up. Normal range is 6.0 to 7.0. Dale nodded. For corn and soybeans, you want to be between 6.2 and 6.8. Anything below 6.0 and you start losing nutrient availability. Below 5.5 and most crops show serious stress. Below 5.0, you're essentially poisoning the root zone. At 4.8, very little can survive. Calvin looked at the map he'd made of the field. The lowest pH readings matched exactly the sections where nothing grew. He turned to the second page. The nutrient analysis was equally stark. Phosphorus levels were critically low across the entire field. Potassium was deficient in the low corner. Calcium, which was both a nutrient and a soil conditioner, was nearly absent in the middle section. Organic matter was less than 1% across the whole field. 1%. Healthy soil ran 2 to 4%. This soil is starving, Calvin said. Dale nodded. Starving and acidic. It's been that way for a long time based on these levels, possibly decades. Whatever management the Greers used, and I suspect they used very little, it allowed the natural soil acidity to build up and the nutrients to deplete without ever replacing them. Is it fixable? Dale picked up a pen and turned to a fresh page on his legal pad. It's very fixable, he began writing. First step is lime, agricultural limestone, to raise the pH. At your current levels, you're looking at 3 to 4 tons per acre in the first year, with follow-up applications in years 2 and 3 to hold the correction. Second step is phosphorus. You'll need a substantial initial application to build the bank up from where it is. Third is organic matter. You need to get something growing that you can incorporate. Cover crops, primarily. Calvin was writing in his notes. How long does the correction take? Lime works slowly. You'll see some response the first year. Meaningful improvement in year 2. And by year 3, if you follow the program, this field should test in normal range. Normal range meaning it can produce. Normal range meaning it should produce like any other ground in the county. Dale set down his pen. Calvin, this is genuinely correctable. The soil texture is actually quite good. This is Miami silt loam under the acidity and the nutrient depletion. That's some of the best parent material in Indiana. The problem isn't the soil. The problem is the chemistry. And the chemistry is just numbers. Numbers can be changed. Calvin sat back. He thought about the Greer family. 3 generations, 60 years of trying. The county assessor who called it agriculturally non-viable. Nobody ever tested it, he said. Dale shook his head slowly. Not through this office. I checked the records going back to 1948. 60 years and nobody ever tested it. Nobody ever asked the right question. Calvin ordered lime in March. 4 tons per acre, 320 tons for the 80 acres, spread by a custom applicator he hired for 2 days. The bill came to $640. He incorporated it with a disc he borrowed from his father. He planted a cover crop of oats and crimson clover in April. Not a cash crop, just something green to feed the soil biology and begin building organic matter. Then he waited. His neighbor to the east was a man named Floyd Dennison, who had farmed the adjacent 160 acres for 30 years. Floyd had watched the Greer bottom sit fallow for 13 years. When he saw Calvin buying lime and spreading it on a field he considered completely worthless, he drove over to say so. Floyd parked at the fence line. He was a large man, deliberate in his movements, who had the confidence of someone who had always been right about farming and had the yields to prove it. Calvin, Floyd, you spreading lime on the Greer bottom? 320 tons of it. Floyd was quiet for a moment, working through the math. That's what, $600 in lime alone? $640, for ground that hasn't made a crop since Eisenhower. The soil test shows the pH is below 5 across most of the field. Once I get it corrected and the nutrients up, the underlying soil texture is actually excellent. Floyd looked at the field. The oat cover was just beginning to emerge, a faint green haze across the gray soil. You had this tested? Last month. Dale Sherwood at the extension office had it done in 12 days. Floyd was quiet for a long time. Then he said, my family's been farming this county since 1921. My father knew Emmett Greer, knew all 3 generations of them, watched every one of them struggle on this ground. He thought for a moment. Nobody ever tested it. Not once. Not through Dale's office, anyway. Floyd pushed his cap back on his head. So you're saying the Greers failed because the soil was acidic and nutrient depleted, and possibly because the drainage in the low corner was impeding root development in wet springs. I'm working on that separately. Floyd looked at Calvin with an expression that was hard to read. It contained skepticism and something that might have been the first edge of doubt about the skepticism. I'll be watching, Floyd said. I expect you will, Calvin said. Floyd drove away. Calvin went back to checking the cover crop emergence. The first year was a study in patience. The cover crop grew slowly, the oats ragged and uneven, the crimson clover sporadic. Not a failure, but not a triumph either. Calvin harvested the oats in July for modest tonnage and incorporated the clover residue in the fall. He pulled another soil test in October. The pH in the low corner had moved from 4.8 to 5.3. Better, but not there yet. The middle section was at 5.6. The north fence line had reached 6.0. He ordered more lime for the spring, another 2 tons per acre on the low corner, 1 ton across the middle section. He applied the phosphorus that Dale had recommended, a heavy initial loading to begin building the bank. He ordered potassium for the low corner. He planted oats and clover again in the spring of 1975. Another year of cover cropping, another year of building. His family thought he'd made a mistake. Not unkindly, but consistently. His father drove out twice to look at the field and came away shaking his head. 2 years and no cash crop. 2 years of lime and fertilizer and cover crops with no return. The $400 purchase price was the smallest part of what Calvin had spent. The inputs were adding up. Calvin knew the numbers. He was keeping them in a notebook. Every dollar in, every soil test, every ton of lime. He was building a record that would either prove the theory or prove the mistake. He believed it would prove the theory. In the spring of 1976, Calvin planted corn on the Greer bottom for the first time. He pulled a soil test in March before planting. The low corner was at 5.8, the middle section was at 6.2, the north fence line was 6.5. Not perfect across the board, but close enough to plant into with reasonable confidence. He planted a mid-season hybrid, a variety his father had used for years on his own ground. Nothing experimental. He managed it the same way he managed any field. Standard population, standard fertilizer application based on the soil test recommendations, standard herbicide program. He did nothing special except plant into soil that had been corrected. The corn emerged evenly across the field in May, something that had not happened on that ground in living memory. Floyd Dennison slowed his truck on the county road and watched from the window without stopping. By July, the corn on the Greer bottom was the darkest green in the county. Not the tallest, not the most impressive looking from a distance, but the color, that deep saturated green that indicates a plant with everything it needs at the root level, that was something Floyd Dennison had not seen on that field in 30 years of driving past it. He stopped the truck in August. Calvin was scouting the field when Floyd pulled over. They stood at the fence line together looking at corn that was setting ears cleanly on every stalk. Floyd said, "I didn't think I'd see this." Calvin didn't say anything. "What's your yield going to be?" "I don't know yet, but the ears look good." Floyd looked at the field for a long time. "The county average is going to come in around 95 this year. Good year, good weather. My best field, the one my grandfather broke in 1924, might hit 110. Calvin nodded. Floyd looked at him. "What do you think you're going to get off this ground?" "I think I'm going to get close to what the soil is capable of when it's in proper condition." "And what is it capable of?" Calvin thought about what Dale had told him 3 years earlier. "Miami silt loam, some of the best parent material in Indiana. I think it's capable of being the best ground in the county," Calvin said. Floyd was quiet for a moment. Then he drove away without another word. Calvin harvested in September. He did not have a yield monitor. He tracked his loads to the elevator, weighed every truck, kept records by field section to know where the high and low spots were. When the last load came in and he added up the numbers, the yield for the Greer bottom was 118 bushels per acre. The county average that year was 96. Floyd Dennison's best field made 112. The ground that the county assessor had called agriculturally non-viable in 1974, the ground that 3 generations of Greers had failed to farm, the ground that nobody had bid on at auction except a 23-year-old with $400 and a semester of agronomy notes, had outproduced every field in Dearborn County except one, and that one was close. Calvin drove back to the Greer bottom that evening after the last load. He parked his truck at the same spot where he'd stood in February of 1974 and looked at gray soil and standing water and 13 years of weeds. He sat in the truck for a long time. He wasn't celebrating. He was thinking about the Greer family, about 60 years of failure on ground that had never been diagnosed, about the simple fact that if Emmett Greer or his father or his grandfather had spent $12 on a soil test and $640 on lime, the story of that family might have been entirely different. He pulled his notebook out of the glove compartment and wrote down the yield number. Then he wrote something else beneath it. 3 generations, 60 years, $12. Word traveled in the way that agricultural news traveled in Dearborn County, which was fast and thorough. By the end of harvest, everyone knew what had come off the Greer bottom. The elevator had the records. The county extension office had the soil tests. Dale Sherwood told the story at the fall soil conservation meeting with Calvin's permission, using the Greer bottom as a case study in what soil testing could reveal. Farmers who had driven past that field for decades started showing up at Calvin's place asking questions. He answered all of them. He was not interested in being remarkable. He was interested in the question that Dr. Bauer had written on the chalkboard in 1970. Before you decide a field cannot be farmed, Find out why it isn't. That question had cost him $12 to begin answering. The answer had turned out to be worth considerably more than $12. The question he heard most often from his neighbors was why. Why had nobody tested the Greer bottom before? Why had 3 generations of one family farmed a field without diagnosing what was wrong with it? Calvin thought about this for a long time before he had an answer he was satisfied with. The answer was that the Greers had known how to farm. They had not known how to ask why their farming wasn't working. Those are different skills. Knowing how to farm is learned by doing. Knowing how to ask why is learned differently. It requires a willingness to admit that the problem might not be what you think it is. It requires the humility to seek information you don't already have. The Greers were not bad farmers. They were farmers who knew what they knew and did not know what they didn't know, and never quite bridged the gap between the two. Calvin had bridged that gap with $12 and a phone call to the county extension office. Let me tell you what the Greer bottom was worth by 1985. Calvin had bought it for $400 in 1974. He had spent approximately $2,800 in the first 3 years on lime, phosphorus, potassium, and cover crop seed. Total investment in soil correction, roughly $3,200. By 1985, the field was producing 125 to 135 bushels per acre of corn, consistently above the county average. The organic matter had climbed from less than 1% to nearly 3% over 11 years of careful management. The pH held steady between 6.2 and 6.7, with annual lime applications that had dropped to less than half a ton per acre as the soil chemistry stabilized. A farm appraiser came out in 1985 to assess the property for insurance purposes. He walked the field, reviewed the yield records Calvin kept, looked at the soil test history dating back to 1974. He valued the land at $1,400 per acre. 80 acres at $1,400 per acre was $112,000. Calvin had paid $400. He had spent another $3,200 in soil correction. Total investment, $3,600. 11 years later, the same ground was worth $112,000. Not because of market movements, not because of anything external, but because he had asked a question nobody had asked in 60 years and spent $12 to begin answering it. Floyd Dennison came over the evening after the appraiser left. He'd seen the man walking the field. He knew who he was and what he did. Floyd sat down at Calvin's kitchen table. What did he say? $1,400 an acre. Floyd was quiet. His own land, the best ground in the county, the 160 acres his grandfather had broken in 1924, was appraised at $1,600 an acre. The Greer bottom was close to the best ground in the county now. I owe you an apology, Floyd said. Calvin shook his head. You said you'd be watching. You were watching. I was waiting for you to fail. Floyd looked at the table. That's different from watching. I wanted you to fail because I'd told everyone you were going to. Calvin looked at him. Floyd said, I drove past that field 1,000 times, watched the Greers struggle, never once thought to ask if the soil could be tested. Never once thought to call Dale Sherwood and say, what's wrong with this ground? I just accepted that it was bad ground, assumed the problem was something unfixable. He paused. Because if it was unfixable, I didn't have to do anything. I didn't have to feel bad about the Greers. It wasn't something anyone could have solved. Calvin understood that, but you solved it. I tested it. That's not the same as solving it. The soil chemistry and the extension office and the lime manufacturer solved it. I just asked the right question. Floyd shook his head slowly. You know what I did last spring? What? I had my entire operation tested, all 160 acres, first time in 30 years of farming. He looked at Calvin, found 2 sections with pH below 6.0, nothing like what you had, but enough to be pulling my yields down. I've been leaving 10 to 15 bushels per acre on the table for who knows how long. Calvin nodded. That's probably 3,000 bushels a year I didn't harvest, Floyd said. Going back maybe 15 years. That's 45,000 bushels. He paused, letting the math settle. Because I never spent $12 to ask what was wrong. Calvin didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. Floyd pushed his chair back. I'm going to be a better farmer going forward because of what you did with the Greer bottom. He stood. I'm not comfortable with that. A man ought to have learned these things on his own. But I didn't, so. He extended his hand. Thank you. Calvin shook it. Floyd drove home across land that was already beginning to tell him things it had been trying to say for years. Let me tell you about the soil itself, because the soil is the real character in this story. The Miami silt loam that underlies the Greer bottom is a soil series that formed over thousands of years from glacial till deposited during the Wisconsin glaciation. It is deep, well-structured, with excellent water-holding capacity and the natural fertility that comes from mineral-rich parent material. Under proper conditions, it is among the most productive soil in Indiana. The Greer family had not farmed bad soil. They had farmed good soil that had been allowed to become acidic and nutrient-depleted through decades of extraction without replacement. Every crop they grew took something out, nothing put it back. The pH dropped, the nutrients declined, the crops got weaker. The weaker crops produced less organic matter when incorporated. The organic matter declined further, the pH dropped further, a slow spiral over 60 years that nobody interrupted because nobody measured it. The lime Calvin applied in 1974 and 1975 did something specific and measurable. It reacted with the acidic compounds in the soil, neutralizing them, raising the pH. As the pH rose, nutrients that had been chemically locked into forms plants couldn't access became available again. Phosphorus that had been bound to iron and aluminum compounds in the acidic environment became soluble. Calcium became available. Magnesium became available. The biological life in the soil, the bacteria and fungi and earthworms that drive nutrient cycling, which had been largely suppressed by the acidity, began to recover. The soil didn't change. The chemistry changed, and when the chemistry changed, the soil became what it had always been. Good ground. Calvin understood this not as a miracle but as science, not as a reversal of fortune but as the natural consequence of diagnosis followed by treatment. The field had been sick. He had found the sickness. The sickness was treatable. He had treated it. The miracle, if there was one, was not in the treatment. It was in the asking. Calvin farmed the Greer bottom for 31 years. He never expanded it, never bought adjacent ground, never turned it into something larger than 80 acres. He said once when a reporter from the state agricultural newspaper came to do a story about him, that one field properly understood was a complete education. He tested the soil every 3 years throughout his farming life. He adjusted inputs based on what the tests showed, never guessing, never assuming that what had been true last year was true this year. He kept records of every test, every application, every yield going back to the beginning. By the time he handed the farm over to his son Daniel in 2005, the Greer bottom had an 11-year running average yield of 148 bushels per acre of corn. The county average in 2005 was 127. The soil that the county assessor had called agriculturally non-viable was producing 21 bushels per acre above the county average, 31 years after a 23-year-old with $400 and a semester of agronomy notes had asked the right question. Daniel farms it today. He has his father's notebooks, every soil test, every yield record, every application going back to 1974. He says they are the most valuable documents on the property, not the deed, not the equipment records, the soil tests. Because the deed tells you that you own the land. The soil tests tell you what the land is capable of. Those are different things. Let me ask you something before we close, and take your time with it. What are you walking past every day that you've decided is the way it is? Not a field, something in your life, your work, your circumstances. What is the thing that you have accepted as fixed, as unfarmable, as the way it is and the way it will remain, not because you've tested it, not because you've asked why, but because everyone agrees that it is and has always been? The Greer family farmed failing ground for 60 years. They were not lazy. They were not incompetent. They worked hard season after season in soil that would not cooperate, and they never asked the question that would have changed everything. Not because the question was hard, not because the answer was expensive, because they accepted what everyone accepted, that the ground was bad, that some ground was just bad, that this was one of those pieces. Calvin Pruitt paid $400 for their failure and $12 for a question. The question cost $12. The answer was worth $112,000. But the real value was not in the money. The real value was in understanding that a problem is not the same as a curse, that failure is not the same as impossibility, that 60 years of everyone agreeing that something cannot be done is not evidence that it cannot be done. It is evidence that nobody has asked why yet. Dale Sherwood, who processed Calvin's first soil test in 1974 and watched the whole story unfold from his desk at the Extension office, retired in 1991 after 29 years as a county agent. At his retirement party, someone asked him what was the most important thing he had seen in 30 years of working with farmers. He thought about it for a long time. Then he said, "The most important thing I ever saw was a young man walk in here with $12 and a question." He had just bought ground that everyone in the county considered worthless. He did not ask me whether it could be fixed. He asked me what was wrong with it. He assumed it could be fixed. He just needed to know what he was fixing. Dale looked out at the room of farmers who had known him for decades. "In 30 years, that is the most important thing I have seen. Not a new technique, not a new variety, not a new piece of equipment. A young man who assumed a problem had a cause, and a cause could be found, and a found cause could be fixed." He paused. "That assumption is the beginning of every improvement that has ever been made in agriculture. It is the beginning of every improvement that has ever been made anywhere." He shook his head slightly. The Greer family farmed that ground for 60 years without it. One young man walked in with it on a Tuesday morning in February of 1974. The difference between 60 years of failure and 30 years of the best yields in the county, $12 and an assumption that problems have causes. That's all it was. That is everything it was. The Greer bottom is still producing today. Daniel Pruitt, Calvin's son, farms it with the same careful attention his father taught him. He tests the soil every 3 years, the way his father did. He adjusts lime and nutrients based on what the tests show, not on what he assumes. He keeps the records. The county assessor's office reclassified the property in 1982. The designation was changed from agriculturally non-viable to prime farmland, Class 1. The same 80 acres. The same clay, the same low bowl between 2 ridge lines. The only thing that changed was that someone asked why it wasn't producing and paid $12 to find out. The marker the county never got around to putting at the edge of the field would read something like this, if someone had thought to put one there. The Greer bottom, for 60 years called impossible. In 1974, Calvin Pruitt asked why. A $12 soil test revealed what the ground had always been. It has produced above county average ever since. Sometimes the curse is just the question nobody asked, and the question is never as expensive as you think.